these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. I'm busted if that's true. But showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. This is commandment 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Honor your father and mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have not coveted my neighbor's ox or donkey lately, so I am doing great. You know, when we read this, it seems like it's from a whole other time, right? From a whole other world. We're like, what does this even mean? We were about to show the Ten Commandments clip. It was from 1956 when that movie came out. And it was the #1 blockbuster of the year. In fact, if you adjust for inflation, that movie, Ten Commandments, is the 7th highest grossing movie of all time. And even though it looked pretty lame on the screens, it actually won an Academy Award that year for special graphic effects. Visual effects. I mean, that's how like groundbreaking and popular this movie was. But if we created a new movie today called 10 Commandments, I don't think it would be as popular. I can't picture myself getting pumped to go see a movie. Is it like Avengers or 10 Commandments? Like, I'm always going to pick Avengers. And so would most people that I know. It's just not the kind of thing that we talk about in our culture anymore. It's not the kind of thing that gets people excited. And in fact, just reading it out loud in church almost felt awkward, right? It was like, why are we talking about this? This is from a different time, from a different place that doesn't seem to make much sense. So this is the goal. And I'm just being straight up with you. This is the goal. I'm hoping that me personally and all of us together can find a way where this still makes sense for us today. There was a big fight not too long ago. It was 15 years ago where there was someone in Alabama that was fighting on whether or not they could have the 10 Commandments in front of the courthouse, right? And it led to all these big political fights and all these things. In fact, I even read in the newspaper today, there's a ballot initiative in Alabama again to try to bring it back, even just this month, that's going to be coming in November. I'm not interested in those kinds of fights. What I'm interested in is helping us discover how this text, how these 10 Commandments, if they still apply to us today. And if they do, how? And how do we make that make sense? So those are the kinds of questions we're going to be asking and talking through in a little bit. But to take a big step back, what I want to do initially is just talk to you about where these 10 Commandments come from, because it's kind of an unusual story. And if you don't know the context, the text that we read doesn't make any sense. So the first line of it is actually really important, because when you hear a list of rules, what do you naturally want to do? Break them. Like when someone gives me a list of rules, I tend to like reject it. I'm not that kind of person. Just this week, I was with about 60 kids in Overtown at a little nonprofit called Touching Miami with Love that I think is an incredible work. And what it does is it has an after-school program. And my job for this week, as just someone who volunteers there, was to show up and lead some kind of devotional. And so I thought, hey, you know what? I'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'll talk about the 10 Commandments and use them as like a test audience for how this is going. So I sat down with 60 3rd through 5th graders and started talking about the 10 Commandments, and they were like, this makes no sense, man. Like, I don't understand why do not lying works, because when I look at the world, lying seems to be super effective. When I look out at the world, stealing, that's what people have done to me my whole life. Those people are doing way better off than I am. So it was a real reality check for me to realize that this text doesn't make any sense unless we really take some time to understand it. Because the world that we see outside of us doesn't really live into this. It doesn't really work. But I'll start with this phrase in verse 2 where it says, before it gets to the commandments, it starts with this: I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Before God ever gives them the 10 Commandments, you know what he does first? He shows them love. Before he gives them the rules, he finds people who were broken and oppressed and chained up, and he frees them and sets them on their way and gives them a new place to live and to become free. God doesn't give us rules because he loves rules. He frees people and then gives them a roadmap for how to live in joy and peace. God doesn't come down and say, hey, here's what I need you to do in order to be happy. He says, I'm going to make you happy already, and now I'm going to show you how to stay happy. So the rules for us aren't something that make us earn God's love. He already loves us. He already saves us. Rules for us are not something we ever do to get lined up with God in a good way. He already chose us and loves us. The foundation of church, of God, of this whole thing that we do, isn't our goodness in following rules, but in his desire to love us first, even when we were broken and oppressed. So that's pretty cool. No one thinks about that in the 10 Commandments, right? That the first line of the 10 Commandments is a word about God's total love and grace. But, all right, so this is how the story works. So the Israelites, they were oppressed for 400 years, it says. So we're talking a very long time. They came down to Egypt because that's where food was. They were up in where Israel was. What's up, Asher? This guy's running. Hi, buddy. Okay. So the Israelites, for 400 years, they were slaves in Egypt. I mean, we have slavery in our country, and it was probably one of the darkest and most cruel and horrible things that our country ever experienced and is still experiencing in many ways. And the Israelites knew what that was like, because for a very long time they were slaves to Pharaoh. And then God heard the cries of the people. That's how the story goes. Moses was a part of this, right? Moses was a part of Pharaoh's family, but he found out that he was actually a Hebrew person and was related to them. So the story goes that Moses goes out into the wilderness, sees a burning bush, and then God meets him in the burning bush and tells him his name, Yahweh, I am who I am, and then sends him back to do all the plagues. And you know this story because you've seen the Disney movie maybe. I don't know if it's a Disney movie. I find that most people know more about the Bible through whatever's on TV than they ever do from the actual Bible, but that's okay. And so what happens is they get freed. And all the Israelites are wandering out into the desert in a place called Sinai Peninsula. And so if you go on a map, you can see what that's like. There's Egypt here, and then you got Israel up above it. But there's this little tiny triangle off to the side called the Sinai Peninsula. I've been there. It's a desert, and it's the middle of nowhere, and it's terrible. My wife and I spent a week in Dahab once near Sharm el-Sheikh, and you can go there and go on vacation. Some of the craziest moments of my life happened in that wilderness. That's a whole other sermon and a whole other story for another time. But one of the things we did get to do while we were there was go climb up Mount Sinai. So we think we've been able to identify the real Mount Sinai. There's a monastery at the bottom of it called St. Catherine's that you can go to where they think they have the original burning bush. I'm not of the opinion that that's the original burning bush, and that's a whole other story as well. But I remember just this odd moment for me in my life. My wife and I and brother-in-law were hiking up Mount Sinai in the middle of the night. We started at about 1 a.m. In order to get to the top for sunrise. And when you get to the top at sunrise, you get up there and the sun starts coming up. And what you look out over when you're there is vast, rocky wilderness. I mean, it is the opposite of Miami in 1,000 different ways. It's just craggy and rocky and not a water drop to be found anywhere, and it's dry and barren. And for some reason, God sent his people out into this rocky wilderness after he set them free. Why? It's because it was in that wilderness space where God was going to shape them into who he wanted them to be. That's often where God messes with us, right? It's in those times that are rocky and messy and dry and tough. That's where God often does his best work on our hearts. And so this is what happened. They go up to this mountain, and the Israelites are down at the bottom, and Moses goes up on the top of the mountain to meet with God, and he has this meeting with God, and God gives them the 10 Commandments. And it says that God himself wrote them on the stone with his finger. And so Moses brings them down, and when he gets back down to the bottom of the hill with these big words from God, do you remember how the story goes? It wasn't even 5 seconds that Moses had been up, and they're already committing idolatry and worshiping other gods at the bottom of the mountain. And for the next 40 years, the story of Israel is this big, massive project of trying to help them figure out who the God of the universe is. When the 10 Commandments came down, I would be upset. I'd be like, why can't God just give us softer rules or be a little bit nicer? But if you were a Jewish person living back then, they viewed the 10 Commandments as one of the greatest gifts that could possibly be given, because In a world where there was a lot of confusion, where people didn't know what to do, the Ten Commandments they saw as the guide, as the helpful thing to get us from point A to point B. What we're going to do today for a few minutes is talk about the ways in which the Ten Commandments serve as a map. They serve as a map, they serve as a curb, and they serve as a mirror. A map, a curb, and a mirror. So the first thing is a map. How do the Ten Commandments serve as a map? And today we're going to use that phrase, you should have no other gods before me, as the rule. You should have no other gods before me. What does that mean? How is that a map for us? What God did when he said that is he was communicating this idea that he's a jealous God. Did you catch that word in the text, that God is jealous? That doesn't mean like we have stuff that God doesn't have. What jealousness means when it says that God is jealous is it means he actually loves us and wants us. It would be like if you were married to someone who you were deeply fallen for, or let's say you're even a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and that person cheats on you. The emotion that you have when someone that you love leaves you or cheats on you is what? You have this deep desire to bring that person back, or maybe you're so angry they left. Why are you so angry when they leave you? It's because you want them so much. That feeling of wanting someone so much to be in relationship with is how God feels for us. That's what jealousness means. And so when God says, have no other gods before me, it isn't necessarily because, we'll talk about this in the guard section, because he doesn't want us to have other people in our lives. The reason why he wants no other gods is because he wants to be our God. It's kind of interesting. It says, you shall have no other gods before me, but the you that's used there is second person singular, not plural. Because I could say y'all, right? That's second person plural. But when he says, you shall have no other gods before me, he's talking about you and me and you. The God of the universe desires a personal relationship with every single person. You shall have no other gods before me. In other words, I want to be your God. I made you to have a relationship with me. A while back I told this story, but I think it's so important. I was talking with another young dad who has a little baby, and we were talking, and he was talking about how much he loves spending time with his little one, his little boy, and we were reflecting as we were talking. He said, you know what, I want to have this great relationship with my kid, but my relationship with my parents stinks. In fact, I hate even thinking about them. I don't want to spend time with my parents. Every time I hear that they're coming to visit, I get anxious and I hate it. Like, I don't want to spend time with them. Don't worry, if you're here with your parents, I'm not talking about you. But you know that feeling, right? Man, I'm so scared to think that the God of the universe wants to have a relationship with me the way I want to have one with my son and my daughter. It's a pretty cool image. You know, the very first chapters of the Bible, what does it talk about? It talks about Adam and Eve being made in God's image. They're like him. They're supposed to be in relationship. And it says that before sin entered the world, you know how things were? God hung out with Adam and Eve, and they would walk around and maybe just play ball and talk about Netflix shows they're watching. And they just had a normal time, spending time together where they enjoyed time together. It says they walked around the garden in the cool of the day. It was another way of saying they were friends. They enjoyed each other's company. And the God of the universe wants that. So this first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is a vision. It's a map for how we're supposed to live and how the world's supposed to work. Now, when I start my day, what I do is I make my calendars every day, and every slot of my day is usually filled up with one thing or another, like a staff meeting here, and then I want to spend some prayer time here, get a workout in here, spend time with my kid. You know, like my whole day is mapped out. But one of the things I've noticed about myself is that I rarely map out my day the way that it's supposed to be. By the time I get to the end of the day, I've either not followed the one that I made, or other really more important things came up that I was supposed to be doing, or maybe I stuck to my calendar and it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing to begin with. But here's what I think is tough. Whenever I have stress in my life and things aren't going the way that I want it to go, what my temptation is not to turn back to God. A quick test of who you love and where you get your comfort from is when you're having a bad day, what do you do to make it better? God says, have no other gods before me, right? But when I'm having a bad day, you know what I do? Do I turn to God first? Very rarely. A good test if you have an idol in your life is when you're having a bad day, what do you do to fix it? What do you do to fix it when you're having a bad day? Let me just give you some of the options I know I've done or maybe you've done before. When you're having a bad day, the temptation is to just check out and say, who cares about this? And turn on the television. When you're having a bad day, you know, I know how I'm going to fix this. I'm going to open a bowl of ice cream, or a carton of ice cream, and just disappear into it for a little bit. When I'm having a bad day, you know what I do? I just need to go shopping. If I could spend some money on Amazon, or if I could just go to the mall and buy some things, that'll take my stress level from here down to here. You know, it's not always like that fun, though. I mean, sometimes when you're having a bad day, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to ignore all the responsibilities in my life and just go have fun and watch a movie or go play sports. Some folks turn to drugs or alcohol or pornography or other things. Anything possible to try and take the pain from here to here. So you know, this is a quick test. What's your God? What's the thing in your life that brings you comfort? Well, that's how you figure it out. When you're having a bad day, what do you do to make it better? That's how you identify what your idol is. When I'm having a bad day and I say, all right, I need to lower my stress, I need to fix things, is my first inclination to say, God, help. Not always. Not always, if I'm honest with myself. I often turn to way lesser gods or way lesser things to make myself happy. This is a silly example, but I have temptations all the time. When I first got married, my wife and I shared a car for the first 10 years of our marriage, and it was a Prius. It was a little silver Prius, and she got to choose the car, obviously. You know, because like a Prius isn't my thing, you know, like I barely fit in it for one. But it just wasn't my kind of car, and we shared it. And so after a few years, when we finally had enough money and I was able to get my own car, you know what I decided to get? I got a Toyota Tundra. Like the biggest car I could possibly drive on Brickell without killing other people and myself, right? So I got this big old truck, and I'll be honest with you, for the last year and a half while I've had it, I felt awesome. Every time I would be pulling out on Brickell, I felt safe. I could look down at all the pedestrians who could be killed at any moment, and look around at all the cars flying in around things, you know, and it didn't matter to me because I'm up on my little thing where I'm comfortable and I'm happy. And this is a little embarrassing to say out loud, but that truck for me was like my comfortable place. If I was having a bad day, you know what I needed to do? Just drive for a little bit in my happy truck. So that was just what it was for me. I don't know what it is for you. I've got a lot of things that I do when I'm stressed, but that was one of them. Well, this last week, my wife and I had to switch cars because I was driving our little one home, and his car seat was in that one. And like one of my big no-nos is never share my truck. The seats get changed, the mirrors get all mixed up. I don't like it, but I thought, you know, this is right for the family. And so I take my little one home in her car. She takes my car home. She pulls up, and the whole back side is scratched. She ran into a wall and scratched up the whole thing. And we're still barely married, but we are. But I mean, she got home late at night, and I was getting ready for bed, and the whole side was like, oh my goodness, you know what, I'm just going to bed. And she knew, like, me just saying I'm going to bed meant like, this is so big, I can't talk about this right now. This is a silly example, but it exposed for me how deeply attached my heart was to a thing when it shouldn't be. When it got scratched, why was I so upset? Yeah, it's going to cost X amount of dollars to fix if we actually really want to fix it. How important is it, really? You know, obviously I'm going to get it fixed because I'll be judged. You know, if you drive on Brickell with anything except like a luxury car, you feel some sort of shame just because of how weird. Prior to moving here, I'd only seen like 2 Mercedes in my whole life. This is a whole different world. Anyway, my point is this. The first commandment, first and second one, you shall have no other gods before me, it's a vision. It's a vision for how good life can be, walking with God. God doesn't give us that commandment because he's jealous and hates everyone else. He does it because he wants to share his love with us so intensely. So intensely. That the God of the universe says, hey, Chris, don't follow a truck. Don't follow TV or a carton of ice cream or how good you think you can look or whatever it is. All those things, you can chase them as much as you want. Here's the vision, Chris. Be with me. I will not let you down, and I love you more than you could ever know. So that phrase, that first commandment, is a vision for how life with God could look like in the garden. The second thing is it's a curb. It's a guardrail. It's a stop sign. You shall have no other gods before me. So in our life, sometimes if we're honest with one another, we need rules. Last year or so, I was driving in Italy, and we were going, it was near Cinque Terre. If you've ever been there before, there are these massively steep cliffs off the coast in Italy. And we were driving this little rental car, and I'm in the back of it, which is terrifying for me because I have no control, right? So I just happened to be on the window side next to the cliff with my father-in-law who was driving our little tiny car, and there was no guardrail on this cliff. And if you went just like a few feet to the right or hit a rock, I don't know what it was, but if you went just a little bit this far, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of feet to the bottom of a rocky death. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm like, do I trust this man? Do I really trust this man? Because my life is totally in his hands, right? He probably thought the same thing when I married his daughter. But anyway, I was like having this moment where I was scared to death because there was nothing between me and death besides the hands of a 60-year-old man who sometimes flakes out. And so I'm sitting there like, man, is this a safe place for me to be? I wish that there was a guardrail between me and chaos and death. I wish there was something between me and that. You know, for some of us, it's an internet filter. Sometimes it's the stop sign on a road. We all need things in our lives to help us from making deadly mistakes when we're making little mistakes. The Ten Commandments are designed to be that for us. And so when we talk about do not lie and do not murder, it will be more obvious there. But the Ten Commandments are a thing designed to help keep us in check. Because the honest truth is that if God wants to punish us, you know how he does it? He doesn't say, hey, I'm going to make your life miserable, or hey, I'm going to cause this to happen to you. Over and over again in the scriptures, when God punishes us, he does. He gives us what we want. He gives us what we want. When God wants to punish you, what he does is he says, Ethan, do whatever you feel like. You're right. You're way smarter than I am, and you can do whatever you want with your life. When God wants to punish me, what he does is he says, Chris, see where that goes. Why don't you just play that story out and see what happens? The Ten Commandments are a thing designed to keep the messed up desires of my heart and crashing and burning from happening. The Ten Commandments are designed to be a step between me and chaos. And so when God says, have no other gods before me, it's not just a vision, but it's also a curb. It's a guardrail to keep me from going astray. Solomon in the Old Testament, if you know anything about Solomon, he asked one day to be the wisest man on earth, and God granted him the desire of his heart. But Solomon's downfall was that he loved other gods. The scriptures talk all about it, how he actually, even though he was a super wise man, apparently he wasn't wise enough to not worship this god and this god and this god, and it eventually led to his downfall. Because after following the love of his tundra, after following the love of his ice cream, after following the love of his drinks, whatever it was, eventually he loved them so much that it led him into dark and nasty places. If he had just listened to that phrase, no other gods before me, and took it more seriously, what probably would have happened is he would have, instead of going off the edge of the cliff, he would have pulled back at the right moment and said, whoa, you're right. That rule's there, and it's designed to keep me safe. It's a silly example, but you all know it. My little daughter, we've got these little plastic things that we have to stick into every single outlet around our house. Why? Because she's dumb enough to think that she doesn't need rules. And that whenever she sees an open thing, she should stick her finger in it and hurt herself and get shocked. The purpose of the rule or the barrier between her and that isn't because I don't love her. It's because I love her so much I don't want her to get hurt. The Ten Commandments are a guardrail between us and chaos. Not because God loves rules. It's because he loves us and doesn't want us to get hurt. And the worst thing that could happen to you and to me is if God said, fine, do whatever you want. Forget that there's any rules and just play around and see what happens. Those have been some of the darkest times of my life. Now, the last thing is this. So the Ten Commandments are a map. They're a guardrail, a curb, but they're also a mirror into our hearts. They're a mirror into our hearts. The rule exposes who we are. So the New Testament says this. Paul says this. He says, before there was a law, I had no idea I was doing anything wrong. It's like one of those best excuses. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be here. I didn't know this was how it was supposed to be. But when God tells us no other gods before him, what happens is I figure out, whoa, yeah, you're right, I do want that. It exposes who I am. One of the things that I started doing about a year ago or more, and I've been doing it some over my life, is this idea of just being in silence, in silent meditation. Way back in the day, I was meeting with a counselor over a decade ago. And she said, Chris, you're too busy. You do too many things. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to just go sit in this room for at least 2 hours every single day and talk to no one and not do anything. Those were the worst 2 hours possibly of my entire life every single day. I would break the rule all the time. And so what I would do is I would secretly bring in my Greek flashcards and just go over flashcards by myself. Or in my head, I would start memorizing things and coming up with to-do lists just because I had to be busy all the time. Why? because my mind was not okay with silence, because in silence, who knows what would come into my brain. It's like you try to stay busy so you don't think about things. Well, what happens when you slow down and you start meditating or praying? This is a lot of the reason why we struggle with prayer. It's because when we're actually quiet before God, our mind starts racing. The first thing that starts to happen is that person that's bothering you at work starts coming into your head and talking to you. And then maybe that angry family member who you're having a fight with starts coming into your head and talking to you. And when you actually slow down enough to be in silent mode for a few minutes, what happens is all the dark voices in your head start to come in. Whenever God says, have no other gods before me, what it is it exposes the fact that you and I have tons of other gods besides him in our lives. We use the phrase gods or idols, and that doesn't make any sense to us. But again, an idol or a god is just the thing you go to for comfort, or the thing that you go to when you're stressed. The thing you go to when you're uncomfortable, or the thing you go to when you're stressed, those are your gods. Those are the things that give you peace. Now, I'll be honest with you. A few weeks ago, our leaders were going through a stressful thing, and we're thinking about how to solve a big issue. And we do all the things that good leaders do, right? We talk to an attorney. That's the step one, right? That's how you know you're going to be okay. You look at your bank account to make sure you have enough to be able to afford whatever it takes to get through a problem. You check on how many resources you have and how many assets you have around you. How many people can you leverage in order to get a problem solved? You know, whenever you have a problem, it exposes who your gods are and who you think you are. Obviously, we prayed as a team and spent time talking to God about that. But I'm often embarrassed when I have a tough time in my life, how I go to God last. When I think I want peace and happiness in my life, I go to the gym. Because I think that if I'm just happy and healthy, I'll be okay. I consult my doctor first, and then I talk to an attorney, and then I check my bank account, and then I make sure I have wise advisors all around me. And the whole time I think to myself, you know what, God's awesome, but he can't really do that much for me. You know, maybe as a last resort, I'll throw up a Hail Mary prayer, or I'll go talk to a pastor about it, or something like that. But this phrase, you shall have no other gods before me, is not meant to be like that at all. It's a vision. It's a guardrail. It exposes the fact that we are wandering people. John Calvin, who was the founder of Presbyterianism in many ways, even though he was just an ordinary Christian guy and theologian, he said that our hearts are idol factories. We are naturally inclined to race and chase after everything that we see. We're almost never content just to be still and to rest in God's presence. My hope for you and for me is that we would become a people who are content with God alone. That we don't need God and money. We don't need God and success. We don't need God and all these people. We don't need God and a truck. We don't need God and awesome health care. All those things are good, and there's no reason why you can't pursue those, and that's okay. But it's not what you should pursue first. I want my peace and my joy to come from a relationship with God alone. So someone asked Jesus once, what's the most important commandment in the Bible? If you could summarize all the Bible or all the Old Testament, what would you say? And he didn't say the 10 Commandments. He kind of said one of them, but this is what he said. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Jesus got the point of the law. He knew what its purpose was. It was to expose the fact that all the other things in our lives will never truly bring us the love and joy and peace that we want so deeply in our lives, but only God can. In my small group this last week, and I'll end with a story, there was a man, we were talking about this story in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, and it was a messy story. It's like one of those stories where you read and you're like, the Bible would be way better if Jesus didn't say all this stuff. This is really hard to read. And we were kind of reading it and wrestling with it and trying to make it make sense. And one of the guys in the group just said, Chris, you know, I wasn't a Christian for a large chunk of my life, but the reason why I'm a Christian is because even if you hate the church and even if you're confused about some things, it's really hard to hate Jesus. It's really hard to hate Jesus. You know, you wrestle with his teachings and you listen to this man who had more love in his heart than anyone in the history of the world, who died for us. You understand that the whole point of having no other gods isn't because God says, oh, you can't have that. It's because he wants us to know him. The God of the universe is so full of love and so full of joy and passion for you and I that anything else would be worthless. That's the reason why this command is here. is to point us toward a better version of ourselves and also a relationship with the creator of the universe. Is there anything else that would matter if the God of the universe decided that he loved you and wanted a relationship with you? I mean, just put it in perspective. When we slow down enough to realize that, we realize these 10 commandments might actually have something to say to us today. Will you pray with me? God, we ask that you would help us to have no other gods before you. And even though that kind of is a weird thing to say out loud, expose in our hearts the things that keep us from you. Whatever that thing is where we feel guilt, where we feel shame, or that thing that's let us down over and over, help us to let go of it so that we can cling more tightly to you. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.